It's been a month since Putin's Russia unleashed its war of aggression against Ukraine. The violence and wanton destruction have pushed more than 12 million to flee their homes. Many found safe passage to the European Union. The war marks a turning point for EU policies, not just on asylum and migration, but also on sanctions, with an unprecedented set of packages being imposed on Russia, on energy, just to reduce gas and oil dependencies on Russia, and security and defense, where member states have agreed to ramp up their defense spending and contribute €1 billion in weapons and munitions to the Ukrainian armed forces. Meanwhile, the EU institutions and member states are trying to figure out how they might reconcile deepening and further enlargement of the European Union. At CEPS, we are closely following these developments with the aim of informing the policy debate with concrete recommendations about the strategic transformation of the European Union.
Unfortunately, Europe still depends on Russian energy supplies. Europe imports lots of Russian coal, oil and gas. For coal and oil, it is actually possible to find substitute suppliers all around the world within a couple of months, let's say. So that is not the key problem. But for gas, it is very different. It will be very difficult to find substitute suppliers immediately for Russian gas. And therefore, it is not realistic to ask that Europe stops all gas imports from Russia today. All that can be done is to prepare a situation whereby in, let's say, 9 to 12 months from now, Europe can do so. And that requires that Europe accepts higher prices. Renewables will be the solution in the long run. But for this year and even for next, we cannot realistically build up enough renewable supplies to make a considerable dent in our need for gas imports. The only way to really both save energy and make room for additional LNG imports is to realize that the European price and the Asian price are very high, but they are together high, and therefore there will be savings by industry and by households both in Europe and in Asia, and Asia is actually bigger than Europe. This means that there should be considerable savings of LNG in Asia this year, and by winter they could be high enough so that they could provide the supplies which Europe might need in case Russian gas will have to be cut to zero.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has motivated a revolution in foreign security and defense policy in the EU and its member states. For example, Germany has committed to spend 2% of its GDP on defense and will establish a €100 billion armed forces fund in order to modernize its military. Sweden and Finland are considering NATO membership seriously for the first time. And Denmark will hold a referendum that might scrap its opt-out from the EU's common security and defense policy. The EU as well has mobilized for the very first time significant amount of money in order to provide lethal military equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces. It is certainly a tectonic shift in the way the EU considers its threats on its border and how it responds in terms of foreign security and defense policy. It also raises the questions about spending accountability and the EU's readiness to use the European Peace Facility, which are questions that must be addressed in due course. The EU has always been forged by crises, and the EU's foreign security and defense policies are now no exception to the rule.
In response to Putin's war, EU has imposed several packages of sanctions over Russia, and it's true that these sanctions no longer have deterrence effects, but they're still making this war very costly for Putin. We've witnessed how Russian currency has been plummeted, the stock market is closed, the big companies are leaving Russian market, and yet EU still has great economic leverage over Russia to make this war even more costly for Putin and his inner circles. To do this, EU can go further with SWIFT-related sanctions because so far they only target 7 banks, while more than 300 banks are out of the penalties. You can better tailor the financial sanctions towards the big Russian banks that are still outside of the punitive measures. EU can further step up its cooperation with its Western allies and also with China to make individual sanctions more effective and better circumvent the money-laundering practices of Russian elites. And most importantly, EU can cut the most considerable income of Putin and his regime by sanctioning trade in energy, and I have oil and gas in mind in particular. And with going further with these sanctions, EU can push Putin and his inner circles to reconsider the continuation of this unjust war against Ukraine.
Our recent policy insight analyzes EU's responses to people fleeing war in Ukraine. Indiscriminate shellings and other war crimes already left more than 12 million people internally displaced in Ukraine. More than 3 million have arrived at the EU borders and have been met with unprecedented compassion and solidarity. European Union has also responded promptly and triggered Temporary Protection Directive. This EU's legal instrument has never been used since the Balkan Wars. It has been designed precisely to respond to such situations of the mass displacement. It provides group-based protection up for 3 years, and it allows for immediate access to employment, education, healthcare, social assistance, and other rights. It has been unprecedented since maybe for the first time people are asked where they want to go. Nevertheless, European member states decided to exclude the asylum seekers and third country nationals from the scope of this directive. For them, there will be adequate measures designed. Let's see and let's hope that these measures are indeed adequate. We also call the EU to rethink its current approaches in the common European asylum system, since in light of international commitments under Global Compact for Migration and Global Compact on Refugees, any policy response must be embedded in equal solidarity, non-discrimination and equal treatment, as well as to be human-centered and to keep the human beings and their agency at the heart.
The war in Ukraine is the culmination of decades of rival visions for the shape of the European security architecture. One of the principles that we were prepared to defend at the very last moment was this notion that Russia does not have a veto and should not have a veto over the foreign policy orientation of states in its so-called near abroad, or in the shared neighborhood between the EU and Russia. Russia, however, believes that it does indeed have a veto, and it could not exercise that veto ultimately at the diplomatic table, and so in an illegal act of aggression, it chose very, very unfortunately to exercise that veto on the battlefield instead. Russia, it must be remembered, is not an ordinary nation state. Even though it may resemble one now more than before, it considers itself not just to be a great power, but also embodies in many respects still today an empire. And empires and nation states behave differently, and empires believe in exceptionalism to an exceptional degree, and their exceptional status, therefore, in the international order. For us in the West, this has been a problem. We've basically said that Russia needs to conform to our expectations of behavior in order to benefit from good and productive relations with us. But the reality is, Russia is going to remain an empire in some sort for the foreseeable future, even within its own borders. And so at some point, Russia remaining the greatest power in the European security order as it currently is, and is likely to remain for some time irrespective of the outcome of this war, there will have to be, it may be a while, but there will have to be some sort of discussion on how to incorporate Russia and its interests in some mutually acceptable fashion into the European security order. This notion of continuing to humiliate Russia effectively, or refusing to engage in business as usual until it becomes good, however we choose to define it, is not going to be a long-term strategy that will allow the European Union to avoid a permanent security dilemma on its eastern flank.